12 B-17 flying fortresses are somewhere over Germany, flying home through a storm that has swallowed the sky whole. No visibility, no radio, no landmarks, and worst of all, their compass is jammed, pointing in the wrong direction, pulling them deeper into enemy territory with every passing minute while fuel gauges sink toward empty and the formation drifts apart in gray void, and every flight manual says the same thing. If your compass fails inside a storm, you die in it. Then, in the lead bomber, a young navigator, barely 23, book-smart math genius but inexperienced under fire, pulls a stick of chewing gum from his flight jacket, looks at the frozen compass needle, and says the most ridiculous sentence anyone has ever heard inside a bomber cockpit. "Give me 60 seconds, I'm going to fix the compass." What followed became one of the strangest and most brilliant navigation tricks of the entire war, a feat of improvisation that would save 12 aircraft and become whispered legend among bomber crews for decades, though it began hours earlier as what should have been a straightforward mission. A precision bombing run on a German rail junction in late 1944, just another sortie in the grinding campaign to destroy the Reich's transportation network, the kind of mission they'd flown dozens of times before. The briefing room had been tense but routine, intelligence officers pointing at reconnaissance photos, weather officers predicting clear skies, squadron commander emphasizing the importance of staying in formation, bombardiers reviewing their aim points, and the young navigator, let's call him Lieutenant James Morrison because that's who he was, plotting courses with the mechanical precision that had earned him top marks in navigation school but hadn't yet been tested in the chaos of real combat. The takeoff was textbook. 12 heavy bombers lifting from English soil in the pre-dawn darkness, forming up over the channel as the sun broke the horizon, climbing to 25,000 feet where the air turns so cold that frost patterns bloom across plexiglass windows and every breath through an oxygen mask sounds like distant ocean waves. Engines roaring like freight trains, the whole formation a perfect geometric arrangement of steel and courage headed toward Germany. The bombing run itself was successful. Flak burst around them in black flowers of explosive death. A few bombers took hits but nothing critical, and the rail junction disappeared under a carpet of 500-pound bombs that sent smoke pillars climbing miles into the stratosphere. But on the return leg, something changed in the atmosphere that the weather officers hadn't predicted. A massive storm front moving faster than forecasted. A wall of clouds that appeared on the horizon like a gray tsunami, and before the squadron could route around it, they were inside, swallowed by a tempest that turned daylight into twilight and then into total darkness. The storm hit with the violence of a physical attack. Clouds so thick they felt like wet concrete pressing against the aircraft, winds tearing at wings with invisible hands strong enough to throw 30-ton bombers around like toys, lightning flickering inside cockpits with electric blue light that left afterimages burned into retinas, and thunder so loud it overwhelmed the engine noise. Thunder that shook the airframe, thunder that felt like artillery bursts, thunder that made seasoned pilots flinch. The formation began dissolving immediately because in zero visibility you can't see the bomber flying 50 feet from your wingtip, can't maintain position, can't follow your leader, so each aircraft became alone in the gray void, pilots fighting their controls to stay level while instruments went haywire from electrical interference and turbulence made the artificial horizon spin like a drunken gyroscope. Radio static drowned every transmission. Nothing but white noise and the occasional broken fragment of a pilot's voice shouting coordinates that disappeared into electromagnetic chaos. And visibility dropped to literally zero. Not even the wingtips visible through the cockpit windows, just gray nothingness pressing against the glass like they were flying through the inside of a cloud that extended forever in all directions. This is when Morrison noticed the compass problem. The magnetic compass needle, which should have been swinging freely to indicate their heading, was stuck pointing 30 degrees off course, frozen in place, and the backup gyro compass was spinning uncontrollably, its gyroscope overwhelmed by the electrical storm and the violent aircraft motion, leaving them with no reliable heading reference, no way to know which direction they were actually flying. He stared at the instruments with growing horror as he realized what this meant. The squadron was being pulled deeper into enemy territory by the storm winds, fuel was burning faster in the turbulent air, and without navigation they could end up over the North Sea with no bearings. A death sentence because running out of fuel over water meant ditching in freezing waves that would kill the crew in minutes, assuming they even survived the impact. Morrison leaned closer to the compass housing, studying it with the intense focus of someone whose life depends on understanding a mechanical problem, and that's when he saw it. A tiny dent in the metal housing from earlier flak, a small impact that had bent the casing just enough to press against the compass card inside, physically jamming the needle in place like a stuck door. He knew immediately what needed to happen. He had to free the needle by tapping the housing to unbend the dent, but he also knew the terrifying risk. The compass was a delicate instrument, the needle balanced on a jeweled bearing that could shatter if struck too hard, and if he destroyed the compass they'd have literally nothing, no heading reference at all, guaranteed death. He couldn't open the compass housing at altitude because that would depressurize the sealed unit and probably ruin it permanently, couldn't use any significant force because that would break the internal mechanism, and he had maybe 10 minutes before the squadron scattered so far they'd never reform, before fuel consumption crossed the point of no return, before decisions made now would kill them all later. His hand moved to his flight jacket almost unconsciously, fingers closing around a stick of chewing gum he'd grabbed from the mess hall that morning, and in that moment an idea formed, ridiculous, desperate, but mechanically sound if he could pull it off. Morrison turned to the pilot and shouted over the engine noise. "We need to tap the housing to free the needle, but if we hit it too hard we destroy the compass, so I'm going to make a shock absorber." And the pilot stared at him like he'd lost his mind. But there was no time for debate, no time for committee decisions, just time for action or death. Morrison unwrapped the gum. His hands shaking from adrenaline and cold, fingers numb despite heated flight gloves, and began chewing it in silence under the red cockpit lighting while the bomber shook violently around him, turbulence making everything rattle, pencils rolling off the navigation table, maps sliding around, and for 30 seconds the only sounds were engines, wind, thunder, and the rhythmic motion of his jaw working the gum into a soft, pliable mass. When it was ready he pressed the gum into a small ball, about the size of a marble, and stuck it firmly to the end of a metal pencil rod from his chart table, creating an improvised soft tap tool, a way to transfer kinetic energy to the compass housing while the gum absorbed the shock and prevented damage to the internal mechanism, turning a potentially destructive impact into a gentle but firm pressure. The pilot watched this preparation and said nothing, because what was there to say? With fuel gauges dropping and the storm showing no signs of breaking and the squadron scattering into a gray void where every bomber was alone with its fear, this absurd plan with chewing gum and a pencil was their only option, their only chance, the only thing standing between them and a frozen death in the North Sea or a crash landing in German territory. Morrison unstrapped himself from his navigator's seat, which was already dangerous in this level of turbulence, and crawled toward the compass housing, bracing himself against the aircraft's violent motion. And the bomber chose that exact moment to hit a downdraft that made them fall 200 feet in 3 seconds, slamming Morrison against the ceiling hard enough to see stars, nearly making him lose his grip on the pencil rod, and the precious gum stuck to its end. Lightning strobed through the cockpit, turning everything into a flickering nightmare of shadows and blinding light, and he finally reached the compass with his face inches from the instrument panel, close enough to see his own reflection in the glass, close enough to see every detail of the jammed needle pointing stubbornly in the wrong direction. He positioned the gum-tipped rod carefully against the compass housing right next to the small dent, took a breath and began tapping soft, precise, rhythmic taps, each one calculated to transfer just enough force to unbend the metal without shattering the internal mechanism. And at first nothing happened, the needle stayed frozen, mocking his efforts. Morrison tapped again, adjusting his angle slightly, compensating for the aircraft's motion, and the needle moved just a fraction, just enough to prove the concept worked, so he kept tapping with the patience of a safecracker working a combination lock, each tap building on the last, and suddenly the needle swung free, released from its prison, but it immediately pointed in a completely wrong direction because the dent had been the only thing keeping it partially correct. Now came the real trick, the moment that would separate survival from death, because Morrison realized with crystal clarity that even though the needle was pointing wrong, the amount it was wrong, exactly 30 degrees, was constant and measurable, which meant he could use it. He crawled back to his navigation table, strapped in, pulled out his charts and plotting tools, and began the most intense mental calculation of his life. He would use the broken compass as if it were accurate, but mentally rotate the entire world map 30 degrees in his head, flying every course with a constant correction factor that he would have to maintain perfectly while the bomber shook and instruments went crazy and his brain fought against the disorientation of severe turbulence. Every direction they flew, Morrison recalculated instantly. If the compass showed 240 degrees, he knew they were really flying 270. If they turned to what the compass called 180, they were actually heading 210. And he did this while also performing dead reckoning navigation based on time and estimated speed, calculating storm drift by watching the direction of ice crystals streaming past the windows, applying wind correction angles that he rebuilt from scratch every few minutes as conditions changed, and monitoring fuel burn to estimate their maximum range before the engines quit. This wasn't navigation. It was high-speed mathematics performed under combat stress with faulty instruments in a shaking aircraft where one mistake meant death for 10 men. And Morrison did it while fighting his own exhaustion and fear, while lightning turned the cockpit into a camera flash every 30 seconds, while his plotting pencils kept rolling off the table and his charts tried to fly away in the turbulent air, while the artificial horizon spun uselessly and the altimeter needle jumped erratically and frost crept across the inside of the windows, obscuring his view. But Morrison wasn't just saving his own bomber. In a moment of clarity, he realized he could save the entire squadron if any of them were still receiving intermittent radio signals. So he grabbed the radio microphone and broadcast on the emergency frequency. All aircraft, fly bearing 270, correct for -30 degrees, acknowledge. And he repeated it 3 times before the static overwhelmed everything again, praying that at least some of the other navigators heard and understood, that they would trust him enough to follow this bizarre instruction that made no sense without context. In bombers scattered across 50 miles of storm, navigators who caught that fragmentary transmission made instant decisions. Some trusted Morrison's reputation and turned their aircraft to follow his course. Some ignored it as garbled static, some never heard it at all. And in that moment the squadron's fate divided along the invisible line between trust and doubt. The storm refused to break. If anything, it intensified, with icing beginning to build on the wings in dangerous accumulations that added weight and reduced lift, making the bombers wallow through the air like dying whales, and fuel gauges continued their inexorable sink toward empty, each needle dropping closer to the red zone where engines start cutting out and aircraft become gliders with nowhere to land. Morrison fought his course corrections with every ounce of mental focus he had, rechecking his calculations, compensating for new wind patterns, adjusting for fuel consumption that changed their weight and therefore their speed, building a navigation solution in real time from incomplete information and a compass that pointed the wrong direction. And every few minutes the pilot would ask, "Are you sure this is right?" And Morrison would answer with quiet confidence he didn't entirely feel, "No, but it's the only chance we've got." The altimeter kept jumping wildly as pressure systems in the storm created false altitude readings. The artificial horizon remained unreliable, spinning slowly in one direction, then suddenly reversing. Lightning continued frying electrical systems throughout the aircraft with random failures that forced the crew to switch to backup instruments. And every few minutes an engine would cough and sputter as moisture contaminated the fuel lines or ice built up in the carburetors. Each cough a heart-stopping moment where everyone held their breath until the engine caught again and roared back to life. Through all of this, Morrison pushed forward with his impossible navigation, drawing imagined lines on his charts, rotating the compass rose mentally by 30 degrees every time he checked their heading, doing mathematics faster than he'd ever done in his life, faster than he'd thought possible, his brain operating at maximum capacity, driven by adrenaline and the certainty that 12 aircraft and 120 men were depending on his ability to think clearly while the world shook apart around him. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably 90 minutes, Morrison saw something that made his heart leap. A faint break in the clouds ahead, a lighter patch in the gray that suggested the storm edge, and he stared at it like a drowning man seeing the surface, hardly daring to believe it was real. The break widened, became definite, became a ragged hole in the cloud wall, and suddenly they burst into sunlight so bright after the storm's darkness that everyone in the cockpit flinched and grabbed for their tinted goggles. And below them, impossibly beautiful, impossibly welcome, was the blue-gray North Sea, and beyond it the green-brown coastline of England, the most beautiful sight any of them had ever seen in their entire lives. The squadron emerged from the storm like ghosts returning from the dead. Not all 12 bombers, but 9 of them. 9 aircraft that had followed Morrison's navigation or made their own lucky guesses, coming out of the clouds within visual distance of each other, waggling their wings in recognition and relief, reforming their scattered formation as they crossed the English coast toward home. The 3 bombers that hadn't followed Morrison's bearing, that had trusted their own broken instruments or flown random headings hoping for luck, were never seen again, lost to the North Sea or crashed in German territory. Their crews gone. Their families receiving telegrams weeks later that said, "missing in action," which everyone knew was a polite way of saying, Dead somewhere we couldn't recover them. Morrison's bomber landed with engines sputtering on fumes, the fuel gauges below empty, running on vapor and prayer, and when the engines finally cut out the aircraft was already rolling on the runway, momentum carrying them to a stop near the control tower where ground crews and mechanics stood staring in disbelief because these bombers looked like they'd flown through hell itself. Ice still melting from the wings, panels dented from hail, antennas bent, one bomber missing half its rudder from a lightning strike, all of them looking like they shouldn't have been able to fly at all, much less navigate home through a zero-visibility storm. The Navigator became a legend that night, sitting in the officers' club while pilots bought him drinks and asked him to explain the broken compass trick, and Morrison tried to describe the mathematics involved, the constant course correction, the mental map rotation, the hybrid dead reckoning, and storm drift calculations, but most of them just shook their heads in amazement because what he'd done sounded impossible even when he explained it. The story spread through bomber groups across England with the speed of wildfire, each retelling adding mythic elements until some versions had Morrison navigating by the stars through breaks in the clouds, impossible in that storm, or using some secret technique taught by a mysterious instructor. It was just math and desperation. But the core truth remained. One navigator with a stick of chewing gum, a pencil rod, and the fastest mental mathematics anyone had ever seen had saved 9 bombers and 90 men from certain death. In the years after the war, flight instructors would quietly refer to Morrison's technique in unofficial training sessions, teaching new navigators that if instruments fail, you use what you have. If the compass is broken, you break the problem instead of breaking the aircraft. If the situation seems impossible, you find the mathematical workaround that makes it possible. And most importantly, that sometimes survival depends not on following the book, but on writing a new page in it with whatever tools you happen to have in your pocket. Morrison himself rarely talked about it in later years. He'd gone on to fly 20 more missions, survive the war, become a commercial pilot, and eventually a flight instructor himself. But when pressed, he would smile slightly and say the same thing. It wasn't brilliant, it was desperate, and desperation makes you creative in ways nothing else can. Makes you see solutions that don't exist in the manuals because the manuals were written by people who survived to write them, not by people who died following the rules when the rules no longer applied. He died in 1994 at age 73, and at his funeral several elderly men showed up whom his family didn't recognize. Men who introduced themselves as the pilots and crew members from those 9 bombers. Men who had flown through that storm 60 years earlier and had never forgotten the navigator who refused to let a broken compass decide their fate, who had turned a stick of chewing gum into a life-saving tool, who had proven that sometimes the difference between life and death is nothing more than the willingness to try something ridiculous when everything sensible has already failed. 12 bombers entered the storm that day over Germany in 1944, and 9 returned. Not because of superior technology or overwhelming firepower or divine intervention, but because one young navigator with frost on his flight jacket and fear in his heart looked at a broken compass and decided that a piece of chewing gum and some creative mathematics were enough to navigate through the impossible, and history proved him right.